Hello and welcome to the video. This is a video aimed at those of you that are relatively new to things like INAV, and it's going to talk about the different flight modes. Now, if you are coming to particularly fixed wing INAV flying from maybe using stabilizers or maybe using nothing at all, the vast number of modes that's available in INAV can be a little bit overwhelming. But you can break them down into individual categories, and I'm very excited to say that INAV now do that within Configurator, and that makes it an awful lot easier to figure out which is which. So in this video I'm going to explain that in a little bit of detail. Now obviously the best place to go to for in-depth information about these different flight modes is the INAV GitHub itself. I'll put a link down below as well as to a link to the other videos that are in the series. That will give you the full chapter and verse on all these different flight modes. You may have found looking in the past in forum notes of older versions of INAV, some of the names have changed, which can be confusing. And because some of the names of some of the flight modes like Angle and Horizon are kind of legacy things from the quadcopter side of the world, for fixed wing pilots it can be incredibly confusing, and hopefully this video will explain it. So I'm going to cover reasonably high level what each of the modes are for and how you use them. So when you look at the documentation or you're thinking about setting up your own particular build, you kind of got to start off at 10. Couple of top tips before we start. First of all is that you don't need to turn multiple flight modes on at once. It used to be the way in the very old days with INAV, but with modern INAV you absolutely don't need to do that. So there's a mode we'll look at in a minute called NAVWP or nav waypoints, and that allows you to kind of load waypoint missions in memory, and the craft will fly it autonomously without you doing anything. Now that manages the throttle, the height, the attitude, the altitude, the whole thing. It does it on its own. So in that you don't need to then also, as well as NAVWP, then turn on altitude hold and auto level and all the other things. Just turning on that one mode will do everything for you. So it's pretty easy and straightforward, and they've been pretty clear about what the modes that you kind of use alongside the main flight modes actually do to avoid confusion. I would recommend start simple. There are some people out there who likes incredibly complicated setup with very, very complicated mode settings for different things. I don't fly like that. I have 3 flight modes that I fly with regularly. I also have the arming and disarm switch, and I have an adhere return to home switch as well. That's it. The only difference is when I'm maiden an aircraft, I also add something called auto tune and auto trim to get the craft all dialed in, and then once I'm happy with it, I kind of don't use them again. So we'll talk about the modes that I use at the end. Again, everyone has their own particular flavor of modes that they really love and their particular setup, but I like to keep it simple. If it's simple, it's easier to troubleshoot and easier to replicate. So let me give you a whistle-stop tour of the different modes that are available in INAV. Any questions, pop them down below. But again, the place to go to for the full detail is in the INAV GitHub link below. And that will also tell you there's also different settings for some flight modes that will actually say how you can change the way that those flight modes behave. So let's start with the simple ones, good old arming the model. So the first two we're going to talk about then are arming and pre-arming. So arming is like the throttle cut switch, but it's a little bit more than that. If you're used to setting up a switch on your radio that you use to make sure that you can't accidentally move the throttle and start the motor and prop or motor and props turning, this is kind of the equivalent. INAV is very clever. It will not arm unless all of the things are okay and it's happy to go and fly. And if you have a GPS installed, then it is going to be happy until the GPS has got a lock as well. And there's some great safety tips with that. So what you normally do is you assign arming on a separate switch. If you're a historical pilot that uses a throttle cut, put it on the same switch as your throttle cut. Again, see the videos in the rest of the series for how I set my radio up. The other one then is something called pre-arm. That's come across, that's really more of a multi-rotor thing. That's like you have to use pre-arm and then arm in a certain combination in order to then arm the craft. It's an extra level of safety. In my personal opinion, I don't think that's particularly needed. I think if you are an experienced pilot who knows that you could have to flick the arming switch to turn things on or off, particularly with fixed wing, then you're kind of okay. Multi-rotor, maybe it's a little bit more difficult because with a lot of multi-rotors, when you arm the multi-rotor, by default the props will start spinning straight away. So you don't want to accidentally hit that switch on the radio as you're carrying your multi-rotor to the flight line. Things will get interesting. But for a fixed wing model, the arming switch is normally enough. So the next one to talk about then are the 4 basic flight modes. These are the main ones that you'll be using to fly your multi-rotor or your aircraft. Most of the stuff I'm talking about here is more aimed at the fixed wing stuff because that's kind of what we're building as part of this series. First one is acro. Acro is a bit of a weird one because there isn't an option to turn acro on or off within the modes tab, because acro is the one that's on if you don't select anything else. And that is where INAV will act like a regular fixed wing stabilizer. It'll be working to avoid any uncommanded movement from maybe a breeze of wind or something else. So it's always making sure that the plane or wing is doing exactly what you're asking it to via the controls on the radio. If you set up any other flight mode, then it's not in acro. If you don't have anything else selected, you're going to be in acro. The next flight mode is incredibly useful if you are learning to fly. It limits the amount of roll and of pitch that you can get out of your fixed wing aircraft, and by default that's reasonably tame. I tend to increase both of those to about 60 degrees. The other cool thing is that it also means that when you let go of the sticks, the aircraft will self-right itself. This is fantastic for very lazy flying, if you want to just fly around, but also fantastic if you are giving somebody a go of your aircraft and you don't want them to get into trouble. So in angle mode, you can't do loops, you can't do rolls, but if you let go of the sticks, it will self-right itself. Now, the next one in this is Horizon. Horizon is a bit of a weird mode, and it's a bit of a hybrid mode in that when the sticks are towards the middle position, then it acts like the plane is in angle mode. As you move the sticks further away, then the plane starts to act more like it is in acro mode. So this still gives you the ability in Horizon to do things like barrel rolls and loops and acrobatics, but if you let go of the stick, guess what? The plane will go back to flying straight and level. Horizon is one of my favorite modes, particularly when you initially launch it. It means that the plane, if you have an issue, will continue to fly straight and level. So with all these, definitely make sure that things like failsafe is set up and working flawlessly. Again, see the other videos, because with something like Horizon set, if it isn't set to come back to you in the event of a failsafe, the plane will just keep going until the battery gives up. The last flight mode is another one of my favourites. It's manual flight mode. Manual flight mode turns off all of the help and support and the stabilisation from INAV, and all INAV does is just apply the expo that you've set up and the mixer for whatever plane or wing you've got, VTAL, traditional plane, flying wing. So this is a great mode that I personally fly in a lot. It's like flying the aircraft in a normal way without INAV installed at all. It gives you a very, very locked in feel. I really like it with a well set up model that's trimmed beautifully. I tend to fly a lot in manual, and INAV is just being used for me for the on-screen display, auto launch, and for the return to home or OD switch that we're going to talk about in a minute. So those are the 4 flight modes. That's it. Everything else is kind of playing with those. So the next one then to talk about then are the modifiers. Now these are modifiers that you can turn on in addition to the flight modes. First one is nav altitude hold. Guess what? That's going to hold the altitude. These things tend to need additional sensors. So for example, the flight controller will normally have gyroscopes to feel rotation, accelerometers to feel movement in each direction. But with things like altitude hold, you're going to need a barometer, ideally a GPS, and it'll use that to sense any movement in height and to manage that. So for example, you could have angle mode and you could have nav alt hold turned on at the same time, and it's going to fly straight and level, and it's also going to make sure that it maintains the height that it's at as well. Other modes in this include things like heading hold. Guess what? That's going to try and keep it pointing in the same direction. So having things like a compass is handy for this, but not absolutely necessary in things like fixed wing. And the last one is a mode for soaring. Now this is relatively new. Soaring is one of those cool things that allows you, if you are a glider pilot, to basically fly INAV, and INAV is still going to behave well, even though essentially you've got the motor turned off as you're gliding around. There are much more sophisticated glider setups, including things like automatic thermal soaring and hunting in things like Ardu plane. INAV isn't there yet, but if you want to put INAV into a soarer, this mode is there for you. The next group of modes are probably the most complicated. All of these are nav modes, so you're going to need a GPS for these things to really get them to work. And these are the more sophisticated flight modes that other things might not have or you may not have seen before. First one is called nav course hold. Nav course hold used to be called nav cruise, confusingly, in INAV 2.6 and below. So you may hear, if you're looking at old posts, that's what they're calling it. And the pilot changes direction via the roll or the yaw stick on the radio. Yaw is usually smoother, and INAV will manage the throttle. So you set your cruise throttle in INAV and it'll basically run at that, but it won't manage the height. So it relies on you having set the attitude of the craft up perfectly. So at cruise throttle, it's going to just fly along. This one is just basically keeping your model on the same course. Nav cruise, you can think of this as course hold that we've just talked about with altitude hold turned on as well. So as well as maintaining the direction, it's also maintaining the altitude. Now this used to be called 3D cruise in INAV 2.6 and earlier, but nav cruise is basically nav course hold with altitude hold as well. See, it is a bit complicated, but bear with me for this. Nav position hold allows you to park the model in the sky. A fixed wing will fly around the GPS coordinates you were at when you initiated the nav position hold, and a multi-rotor will just go into a hover. It maintains the altitude, but the altitude can be changed using the pitch sticks, and you can also change the direction of the loiter, either right hand or left hand, if you're flying a fixed wing. Nav return to home allows you to have the model fly back to you. So if you have an issue, then if your FPV signal kind of gives up, or maybe the radio starts beeping because the battery's running out and you hadn't spotted it, you can just hit nav return to home and the thing will come back to you. This is also very useful for things like line of sight flying. If you get to the edge of line of sight and maybe the sun goes in and you lose orientation, nav return to home will immediately have it flying back to you. Nav return to home on a fixed wing will go up to the altitude that you have set. Different options for that, but again, we'll cover that later in the series. It'll fly back to you, and then by default, as it comes over the home location, it'll circle over your head. Multi-rotor is slightly different. It'll do everything like that, but when it gets to the home location, it will pause, then descend, land, and turn itself off. So if your radio is completely US, you have a complete failure, the nav return to home will kind of save you bacon. You can also do things with nav return to home, like set things called safe homes. So have alternative locations that are deemed as safe, so that maybe the area that you're in, you can take off, but you're quite enclosed, and maybe there's a field next to you that has a much wider open area. Because the GPS is only accurate to several meters, it's probably safer having it in that field. You can set that up too. INAV return to home is one of the things that I install INAV into my wings and planes for, particularly when I'm putting things like action cameras and expensive FPV stuff on them. Last two are also quite funky. These are more advanced modes. So things like nav WP, or nav waypoint is what it stands for, allows you to load a set of waypoints into memory in the flight controller, and it will fly those autonomously. You can set their location and you can set the height as well and how it flies between all of them, and it's a great way to kind of fly a mission essentially with it all done autonomously, and you can kind of just sit and watch the whole thing happen. The last one is called GCS Nav. GCS Nav is it's not really a mode as such, it's kind of a permission. You can use it with lots of other flight modes, but it allows you to control the craft using a ground station. Not something that I do here a lot. Again, that one is pretty advanced stuff. So hopefully you're still with me. Next lot we're going to talk about are the ones specifically aimed at us fixed wing pilots, which is perfect as I'm building a fixed wing in this series. First one is auto tune. Auto tune allows you to fly the aircraft, put it into acro mode. If you remember, that's one of the 4 flight modes that you are in by default. And then once you're in acro, then just put it into auto tune, and you can rock the plane from side to side, pitch the nose up and down, and there's a whole process that you go through, and it will do a pretty good job of tuning the model. The way that INAV does an auto tune has changed quite significantly over the last several versions, but the process is kind of the same. The outcomes are slightly different. In the last version, it doesn't actually tune the P and I gains in the same way. The next one is servo auto trim. Servo auto trim allows you, when you're flying straight and level, to tell INAV that it kind of needs to see where all the servos are and make a note of those positions. They become the midpoints. Personally, I like to have continuously trimmed servos turned on within INAV, so I don't have that as a separate mode. INAV is always kind of figuring out where the servos need to be, and then once I've had a couple of flights and it's happy, I turn that off. And that's all part of my kind of maidening process. Next one is auto level. Auto level is really good because most fixed wings actually fly slightly nose up, anything from kind of 2 to 8 or 9 degrees, and you need that slight attitude because if it's flying straight, it'll actually be losing height. So you need that slight nose up. Now that is done with a parameter inside the INAV stuff, but using this, you can just fly straight and level and try and keep it as straight and level as you can. Turn auto level on and INAV will figure that out and set that offset automatically. Once it's set, you can kind of turn it off, INAV will save it, and then you probably don't need to visit that again. In INAV 5.0 and onwards, you are able to adjust that value slightly using the radio, but historically it was kind of something you had to land and play with. But auto level will let you set that, and auto level, trimming the servos and doing things like the auto tune are 3 of the things that I do on my maiden, and then I never touch them again. Next mode is nav launch. Now nav launch is one of those fab things that allows you to set everything up on the model. You just throw it into the air and INAV will catch it and take it off, sail it into the air, and then you can take it over and fly it. It means that for those of us that like to chuck models, where maybe it might not always go swimmingly to plan, INAV auto launch will take care of it. I don't use it myself as a mode. Personally, I turn on auto launch all the time, so as soon as I arm the model, auto launch is there by default, unless I cancel it by wiggling the sticks. It just, for me, it's the way that I tend to work. I don't tend to fly a lot of stuff with landing gear, so as soon as I arm it, I can just go through the auto launch process, throw it into the air, and I'm flying. Loiter change is, surprise surprise, lets you change where the loiter is, and the last one then is something called turn assist, and that kind of mixes in a little bit of rudder into the ailerons, just makes the model fly a lot better if you want the turns to be a little bit more coordinated. If you don't understand what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. If your plane hasn't got a rudder, you probably don't need to worry too much about this. I don't turn it on personally, and I don't use it either, but then I fly a lot of wings. Last couple of areas now, these are relatively quick to cover. OSD modes. So in the OSD tab within the configurator, you can set up multiple different OSD screens. Most pilots tend to only set up one with the information they want on it, and they're good. However, you could have various ones if you have a sophisticated setup. So you might have one for general flying, you might have another OSD set up for mission flying, you might have a third one which has an awful lot more information. By using these modes, you can turn the OSD on and off, and you can also choose between the default on-screen display layouts and OSD layouts 1, 2 and 3 by selecting the mode. And then the last ones we'll talk about are the miscellaneous modes. This is a bucket of stuff. There's some nice stuff in here though. First one is beeper. Guess what? That makes the beeper sound. Fantastic mode. I actually do use that one myself because it allows you, if you have a piezoelectric buzzer in the fixed wing, allows you to sound it. Incredibly useful if it comes down in a field with long grass and you can lift your goggles up and you ask your spotter where did it come down and they're not sure. You can kind of walk out towards where you think it is, make the buzzer sound, and you can find it again. Also have options to reset home. Naturally, when you arm the model, usually the place that you arm the model is considered the home location. You might want that to be somewhere else. That mode allows you to change it. There's also a mode called WP Planner that allows you, as you're flying around, to record the waypoints so you can play them back at a later date. Black box is there to start recording onto the memory inside the flight controller. Can be an SD card, sometimes it can be non-volatile memory that's actually inside the flight controller itself, and that's saving all the log files. Very handy, particularly in the early stages. If you have a problem, you can look at the log files and see what the flight controller did or didn't do. And then you've got a couple around failsafe and kill switches, which are ones that you use to test the failsafe stuff and also make sure that you can make the model safe. And then there's another couple called user 1 and user 2. Those I only tend to come across. They usually tend to be specific for flight controllers that maybe have something like camera switching on them, and you use one of those kind of user modes to do that. But that's usually in the documentation of the flight controller that you're using. And the final section is around FPV camera. There are 4 modes in here. The first one's called Cam Stab. This has been around since clean flight days, very long time. It allows you to put a pan and tilt servo on the model and stabilize the camera that you have on it. It isn't widely used these days. Modern action cameras do that kind of stuff automatically and do auto stabilization. And then you have another 3 controls that can do different things with your FPV camera. So there's quite a lot, isn't there? However, let's strip it all back and let me talk to you about the one that I actually use. First one, of course, is the arming switch. I have an arming switch on my radio that's set on a dedicated channel, and that's the one that I use to arm and disarm the model. It's the same switch on the radio that I've been using for throttle cut for decades, and it's the one that my hand goes to in the event of a problem. The other flight modes that I tend to use here, I use things like Horizon and manual. I tend to fly, again, Horizon is the default mode as it comes out of auto launch and it cancels into Horizon mode, so it auto levels. So if I'm not quite ready or I've just caught the sticks accidentally, it doesn't immediately just crash into the ground. It'll fly itself and then I can take it over. Once I'm happy, then I'll usually switch into manual mode and use INAV essentially just for the on-screen display and then return to home if I have a problem at that point. If I'm going to use any nav modes, then the one that I'll put in the third position of the 3 position switches is nav position hold. That allows me to kind of essentially park the model at the sky. Maybe, you know, I've got a bee trying to crawl down the back of my shirt or whatever it is at the field. It allows me to take care of that, to kind of park the model and have it fly in a circle, or if it's a multi-rotor, sit in the air, and I can kind of get rid of the bee, pull my goggles back down, and then turn that back into manual mode and continue the flight. I do have nav return to home on an adhere switch, and that means that when I have a problem, maybe my FPV has a problem, or like one of the situations I talked about before, I can flick that and have the model come back to me. Obviously, I talked about the fact I have nav launch turned on as a permanent thing, so it's not set up as a mode. As soon as I arm it, it's set like that, so I can just throw the wing in the air and off it goes. And the only other mode that I have on my momentary switch is the beeper, and that allows me to find the model if it comes down in the long grass that tends to be in a lot of the fields and meadows at the moment around here in summer. There are a couple of other modes that you probably noticed on here that are a slightly different colour. Let me talk about those. Those are modes that I only use for the maiden flight typically. Once the maiden flight's out of the way, I don't really have a use for them. First one is the acro mode. To do things like auto tune, you have to be able to select acro mode. So in a maiden flight, once I've got everything set up, I will go and use the auto tune while the model is flying in acro to get that all tuned up. The second one then is I'll also use auto level, and auto level will then be used to just set that board offset so that the model is flying straight and level. And that, along with the continuously trimmed servos being clicked on in INAV, will mean that at the end of the maiden flight, the model will be pretty much set. So hopefully you can see there, although there's a massive list of things that INAV can do and can choose from, and that can appear overwhelming, when we actually boil it down, you probably only need 3 flight modes, and you need an arming switch, and I would probably have your beeper as well. And for me, the 3 flight modes, I would recommend you have angle or horizon. Horizon is better in my humble opinion, because it still allows you to flick and roll and do more aggressive maneuvers if you need to get the model around quickly. And then I tend to fly a lot in manual mode, which if you're a pilot who's not used to INAV, it's kind of like going back to what you had before, but you now have all the benefits of the INAV telemetry, return to home, etc. And the other mode I'll have again is the nav loiter. That's just there, and I'll change that out occasionally. That third mode will be swapped to something else, and I like the nav WP mode if I'm flying a mission. So stick with me for the other videos in the series, and we'll carry on with the build. Hopefully now, if you're going to be building yours, you've got a rough idea of which of those modes are going to be right up your street. Thank you for spending your time today watching that video. You can find me in all the usual places on social media, and if you're trying to learn about a subject, then check out the playlist. All of my videos are organised into easy to follow playlists that if you're trying to learn a topic will take you from the basics right the way through to some pretty advanced stuff.